Robert Lightfoot, thanks very much for giving us some of your time today. I suppose, first of all, you're here at University College Dublin. You've been looking at the team, or speaking to the team who are developing Ireland's first satellite. Ireland obviously has a growing space sector, both in terms of science and in terms of industry. What advice would you give to all of those who are involved in building that sector?
Well, I think it's just part of the global economy that we have going on right now. If you look at space is where everybody seems to be coalescing. We have agreements, NASA has agreements with 120 countries, right? Over 800 agreements in total. So it's just the next economy, I think, that's waiting to be mined by anybody that can get involved in it. It creates two things. It creates a workforce that's just pushing the envelope. To me, that's the economic viability of space. Not to mention just the sheer fascination in research and scientific discovery we get there.
Mm-hmm. In terms of NASA itself and what you're working on at the moment, I mean, there's any number of things we could talk about, but for you personally, what upcoming missions or projects are you most excited about right now?
Yeah, I think probably I'd put it in three categories. In the science category, it's James Webb Space Telescope. We're going to launch that in 2018. It's the Hubble successor. It's going to look back in the universe further than we ever have before. Very exciting mission there. In aeronautics, we're working on what's called the Low Bloom Flight Demonstrator. It's a supersonic demonstrator trying to build a capability where we can fly supersonic across land, but not have the noise bother us, and hopefully that'll open a whole new industry. And then human space flight is pushing humans further into space than we ever have before on our Space Launch System in Orion. Very exciting mission, and I think that's going to actually change the dynamic as we start heading toward Mars.
And of course, that is central to getting to Mars, I guess. Realistically, when are we going to get humans on the surface of Mars, do you think? And what is the biggest hurdle in that entire thing? Is it getting there? Is it when they get there, or is it getting back, or what?
All of the above. I think those are all challenges that we have to deal with. But what I would tell you is that what we're working on now is the infrastructure. If you think about the transportation system and the infrastructure systems we need to get there, there's systems we need to get there, there's systems we need to land, and then there's systems we need to come home. And so we're building those, have a stepping stone approach, using the International Space Station to develop some of those technologies, see what happens to humans on orbit. But that's the kind of challenges we're working on. It's really the transportation system to get there, the habitat mentality on the surface, and then the transportation system to get home. So those are the things we're working on today, but we're just really starting on that journey.
What about the moon? A lot of people are really excited about the prospect of getting back to the moon. What's the likelihood of that happening and getting onto the surface, I guess?
Yeah. So for us, we're focusing more on getting into the area around the moon, and we think you can do several operations from there on the surface of the moon without having to go to the surface. Several of our international partners have said they'd love to go to the surface of the moon, and we're saying we'll go with you, and we'll actually take you there on the Space Launch System if you need to get there. So there's good opportunity there to have some good dialogue. Again, each international partner is bringing a different piece to this story and a different need, right? And so we're all working together to try to make sure we're all kind of moving the ball down the field, is what we like to say, right?
Some hugely exciting developments and discoveries in the area of exoplanets, not least in the last week or so. I guess more and more it looks like we're not alone, but how are we going to get spacecraft and perhaps eventually humans to these places to find out for sure?
That's a great question. Part of it is what we're doing now is trying to identify where do we want to send something, and then you're talking a very long trip, right? A very long trip, generational type trips as we talk about. So a couple things we're working on. First of all is identify, and then decide how we're going to get there. We're going to need advanced propulsion systems that we don't have today. So we're working at a technology level on those kind of things to say how can we get from our solar system to another solar system. It's truly interstellar travel. And that's going to require some advances in technologies. We're starting that, but it's a pretty low level. But most of our focus right now is on can we detect it with instruments here from our own solar system going forward.
And with all this mounting evidence at the moment, what's your own view? I mean, do you think that undoubtedly at this stage there must be other life out there in the universe?
Well, my view is that we keep looking, and when we find it, we'll find it. But we're not turning anything off because we need to keep looking, and that's what we want to do. So a fundamental question for us is there life out there, or are we alone here in the universe? We think that's what our Science Mission Directorate does pretty routinely to try to determine those things.
Mm-hmm. The International Space Station, I think you mentioned at your lecture earlier today that its lifespan is looking like 2030 at this stage. What happens beyond that? Will there be another one?
We're not working on another one at this point. What we're really trying to do is use the International Space Station we have today, It's approved through 2024 from all the different countries that have to participate. What we want to do is create a kind of an economy in low Earth orbit where people can have their own laboratories, their own opportunities for us to come and use, right? From that standpoint. So that's what we're trying to do. We're not working on anything past that. We're working on the infrastructure that would be the next step, out around the moon that gets us ready for doing that deep space transport going forward. But we also think if we use International Space Station Day, we'll create an economy that will allow people to have private labs that we can use for any research we need or anybody needs from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. In terms of I guess NASA's brand, you're mostly associated with space, but of course, as you mentioned earlier, you're doing a lot in the area of aeronautics as well. You mentioned, I think, at your lecture in terms of hybrid electric for space or for
aircraft.
Yeah. Where is that going, and how soon are we likely to see that?
Yeah, we're working on some demonstration vehicles that have that take advantage of the same thing you're seeing in cars, right? Can we do that in an aircraft environment for several reasons, right? Obviously, the environmental impact of air travel. We're pretty early in those stages of what would it look like to actually field a system like that, but the technology and the aeronautics research going on now within the agency is actually demonstrating we can probably do this at some level. So I'd say we're pretty early on in that research technology development piece, but we think it's very promising for what we can go do.
There's been quite a lot of discussion recently about your budget and your, I think it's 19.6 billion is what it's at the moment, and the fact that some areas are going to have to be cut back, including education and the asteroid redirect mission and some other areas. Is this a sign that perhaps space is not being taken as seriously as it previously had been by administrations in the US?
Oh, I think actually just the opposite. I think if you look at the other budgets that have in the US, NASA fared very well. As we look at the other fiscal constraints that the agency has, that the country has, they're trying to balance. NASA did very well. Yeah, we've got a couple of things that we've got challenges on, but the basic core mission that we do in human spaceflight, science, aeronautics, and technology is pretty stable. And I think what it proved to us is that the administration has told us we're very comfortable with what NASA's doing, and we want you to continue. And our Congress has supported that all the way.
You mentioned, I think, in your lecture earlier as well about the importance of fundamental research that is at the core of what you do. An ongoing issue or debate here in Irish science is the funding of this basic science, as we call it. How important is it that we make sure that is properly funded?
Yeah, there's several agencies in the U.S. that do fundamental science. We think it's important for us to do the science in the areas that we are actually researching around, whether it's planetary astrophysics, Earth, heliophysics, even what's happening to the human body. So we try very hard to make sure we're funding those. It's important for us because we want to be on the leading edge of the research, because we're the one that we then have to build the systems to deal with it, right? And so I think that's the way we look at it and why we think it's important.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, before we did this interview, I asked Twitter followers whether they had any particular questions. One person came back wondering what your favorite sci-fi movie is.
My favorite sci-fi movie? I would have to say The Martian, right? And I think that's the most realistic sci-fi movie I've seen. My favorite one overall was the original Star Wars, though.
Robert Lightfoot, thank you very much indeed for taking time.
Thank you for having me.